For 6 nights, crowds in Kyiv chanted one name. Not the presidents, not the ousted ministers, a general's. And on the 7th day, Zelensky gave them what they were asking for. This is the story of how Ukraine changed commanders in the middle of a war, and why the man crowds were chanting for turns out to have a stranger. More complicated history than the headlines are giving him credit for. Welcome back. Let's start with the crisis that made this necessary. On July 15, Zelensky dismissed his defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, a 35-year-old reformer who'd held the job just 6 months, but had already built a reputation for modernizing Ukraine's military technology and fighting entrenched corruption. Fedorov didn't go quietly. He said publicly that he'd clashed with Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky, that he'd personally urged Zelensky to remove Syrsky instead, and that Zelensky had refused. Within a day, protesters were in the streets of Kyiv. Within a week, it wasn't just civilians. A deputy Air Force commander resigned, a pro-government media outlet paused its own operations to join the demonstrations, and members of Zelensky's own party were telling reporters, on the record, that they would not accept the outcome as it stood. Zelensky himself, facing the crowds, initially tried to buy time, saying publicly that he was listening and that no final decision had been made, a rare admission of uncertainty from a wartime president who usually projects nothing but resolve. That's an extraordinary thing to watch happen inside a country still fighting for its survival. And it's where one particular name kept surfacing night after night on the placards and in the chants, Drapati. So who is he, and why him specifically? Mikhailo Drapati is 43 years old, trained entirely within the armed forces of independent Ukraine. Never in the Soviet system, unlike much of the older command generation. His story as a commander starts in 2014, as a major leading a battalion of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, deployed into the chaos of the war's opening months around Mariupol. In May of that year, when armed men without insignia, Russian forces in every way but the patch on their shoulder, tried to storm the city's police headquarters, Drapati led from the front, personally breaking through a barricade in an armored vehicle. That's the kind of story that either gets forgotten in a long war or becomes the foundation of a reputation. For Drapati, it became the foundation, repeated by soldiers who served under him long before most of the country outside the military had ever heard his name. After the full-scale invasion in 2022, he was repeatedly sent into sectors where the chain of command had effectively broken down, and repeatedly managed to stabilize them. As deputy chief of the general staff, he took over crisis command around Kharkiv, and became one of the key figures behind defeating Russia's heavily publicized Kharkiv offensive in May 2024. A failure significant enough that it helped convince Washington to finally let Ukraine strike targets on Russian soil. That's a real blow delivered to the Kremlin, not a symbolic one. It's worth pausing on that point because it means the man now running Ukraine's entire war effort has a documented history of personally reversing situations other commanders had already written off as lost, not once, but as something close to a recurring specialty. Here's where the story takes its first real turn, and it's the part most casual coverage skips past. In June of 2025, a Russian strike hit a Ukrainian training facility, killing soldiers under his command. Drapati resigned. Not because he was pushed out, because he decided the responsibility was his to carry, whether or not a tribunal would have agreed. In his resignation statement, he said something that soldiers do not forget: that circular responsibility and impunity are poison for an army, that a military where commanders are personally accountable for the lives under them is alive, and one where nobody is accountable for the losses is dying from the inside. That single decision, walking away from command rather than deflecting blame, is exactly why crowds in Kyiv a year later were chanting his name instead of someone else's. Now, here's the second turn, and it's the one that actually explains this month's crisis. According to Fedorov, Syrsky didn't just sideline Drapati after his return to service. He formally reprimanded him 3 separate times, reprimands that Fedorov says were essentially punishment for battlefield success rather than failure. The former Azov chief of staff, Bohdan Krotevich, has said publicly that Syrsky consistently denied Drapati the authority and the room he needed to make real changes. Whatever the internal politics behind that, the effect was the same. A commander with a track record of both battlefield competence and personal accountability was being kept on a short leash by the very system Fedorov was simultaneously trying to reform. Those two conflicts, Fedorov versus Syrsky and Syrsky versus Drapati, were really the same conflict, just fought on two different fronts inside Ukraine's own command structure, years before either dispute became public enough for anyone outside the military to notice. So when the protests demanded Syrskyi's removal, they weren't asking for a random replacement. They already knew who they wanted next, because he'd already spent years demonstrating in public view exactly what they thought was missing from the top of the chain of command. On July 21st, Zelensky made it official. Syrskyi was out, thanked for defending Kyiv in 2022 and for major operations since, but out. Drapati was in, alongside a broader shakeup. Syrskyi's ally at the head of the general staff, Andriy Hnatov, was replaced too. Zelensky said the goal was to reorganize the entire structure of the general staff, not just swap one name for another at the top of an org chart. Drapati himself struck a tone very different from the man he was replacing, talking about delegating real authority to corps and brigade commanders instead of micromanaging from the center, about ending the doctrine of holding every meter of ground at any cost in favor of preserving soldiers' lives, and about honest loss reportings without punishing the messenger. It's a strikingly specific list of promises for a first day in the job, which suggests he'd been thinking about exactly this plan for far longer than the 6 days of protests that finally made it possible. Russian military commentators picked up on the change almost instantly, and not happily. One well-known mill blogger called it straightforwardly bad news for Russian forces, describing Drapati as a genuinely capable general rather than a blunt instrument. Another noted, with what reads like real unease, that Drapati is only 43 and started this war as a battalion commander, meaning he's risen through every rank while the war itself was actually being fought, which makes him a very different kind of opponent than a general who learned command doctrine somewhere else entirely, in peacetime, decades ago. A third commentator, on a channel that has spent years insisting Ukraine was about to collapse, described the change bluntly as a disaster for their own side, the kind of admission that tends to matter more precisely because it isn't the one they usually make. None of this guarantees a smooth transition, and switching commanders in the middle of an active war carries its own risks, regardless of who's taking over. But the sequence itself matters. This wasn't the story of a president quietly removing an inconvenient general behind closed doors. It was 6 days of open pressure from active duty officers, veterans, and Zelensky's own political allies, converging publicly on one specific name. And Zelensky, however reluctantly, listening. The crowds in Kyiv got the name they were chanting. The general who once walked away from command rather than dodge responsibility for it is back in command of the entire war. And in Moscow, the people who track this kind of thing for a living are already saying, out loud and without much hesitation, that this is genuinely bad news for them.